In November of 1985, then Sierra Leonean President Siaka Stevens, who had already been in power for over 17 years, and who was then well into the 8th decade of his life, handed over power voluntarily to a man that was least expected by the nation, the then Sierra Leonean Army commander, Major General Joseph Saidu Momoh, who had been the military chief for 14 years. His rise to power is unusual in a continent where military personnel usually come to power through a military coup. For the first time, a military head of a nation's armed forces, while still a serving officer, was adopted as a leader of the single political party and, by referendum, voted into power a civilian head of the state. Without using physical force, the military head was constitutionally elected president of the state. In this episode, we cover the rise and fall of Sierra Leonean second president, Joseph Saidu Momoh. Joseph Saidu Momoh was born on January 26, 1937 in the rural town of Binkolo, in the Safroko Limba Chiefdom, in the Bombali district in the northern region of what was then known as British Sierra Leone. He was born into a Christian family who were of the Limba tribe that are predominantly found in the northern region of the country. His family migrated to the nation's capital, Freetown, in the early 1940s. Then Sierra Leone was under the colonial rule of British, with Freetown as the colonial seat of power and the interior of the country as protectorate. After getting his elementary education from 1943 to 1950, his secondary education from 1951 to 1955, and a tertiary education for about a year, he briefly worked as a third-grade clerk in Sierra Leone civil service from 1956 to 1958, before resigning in 1958, and in September of that year, he enlisted as a private in the then Royal West African Frontier Force, which was a multi-battalion field force, formed by the British Colonial Office in 1900 to garrison the British West African colonies of Nigeria, Gold Coast, now known as Ghana, Sierra Leone and Gambia. Thus, Momoh started a long distinguished military career. The same year in which he enlisted in the army, he was enrolled at the Regular Officers Special Training School in Ghana, where he did preliminary officer cadet training. As an ambitious and hard-working young man, Momoh found himself being frequently recommended by superior officers for further training. After gaining battalion experience, he was sent to Nigeria, where he successfully completed a course in infantry weapons in 1960, and in 1961, he pursued an advanced course again in infantry weapons at the School of Infantry in England. Sierra Leone gained its independence from Britain on April 27, 1961, and when the British officers who were serving in the Royal Sierra Leone military forces after independence in 1961, and who had high regard for him, confirmed that Momoh was fitting officer material, he was again sent for further training at the Nigerian Military Training College in Kaduna. While in Nigeria, he met the future Nigerian head of state, Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida, and the both of them became course mates and friends. At Kaduna, the young cadet officer passed out in style. He successfully completed his officer cadet course and won the prestigious Baton of Honor in 1962. That same year, he proceeded to England, where he entered Mons Officer Cadet School in England for the final phase of officer cadet training, which he completed in November 1963, winning the Sword of Honor as the most outstanding overseas cadet. He returned home in 1963 and joined the then Royal Sierra Leone Military Forces with the rank of second lieutenant. He then became a member of the newly created Officer Corps of a young army in a newly independent African state. As a highly disciplined and efficient young officer, Momoh found himself moving rapidly up the ladder in the military hierarchy. He was promoted to captain and appointed adjutant of the 1st Battalion, Royal Sierra Leone Regiment. In 1966, he was elevated to the rank of major, while he was commanding Moa Barracks in the rural town of Daru in eastern Sierra Leone. In 1967, Momoh married Miss Hannah Victoria Lucinda Wilson, a young lady from the Moyamba district in the southern region of the country, who was then employed in the Sierra Leone police force. In the same year of 1967, Sierra Leone held its second general election, with the first being held in 1962. Opposition leader Siaka Stevens of the All People's Congress Party, the APC, narrowly won the election, and he was sworn in as the country's third prime minister in March 1967. However, within hours of taking office, Siaka Stevens was ousted in a military coup. After 13 months of military rule, the APC was restored to power following a counter-military coup with its leader Siaka Stevens as Prime Minister of the country in April 1968. The counter-military coup that returned Siaka Stevens to power saw 76 army and 48 police officers arrested and detained at the Pademba Road prison in Freetown. Momoh therefore found himself detained at the Pademba Road prison in Freetown. He was released 7 months after the return to civilian rule, and he was reabsorbed into the military as an officer at military headquarters. In 1969, Momoh, who gained the trust of Prime Minister Siaka Stevens, was promoted to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel and appointed Deputy Force Commander and Commanding Officer of the 1st Battalion, Royal Sierra Leone Regiment. In 1970, he became a full colonel. On March 23, 1971, the force commander, Brigadier General John Amadou Bangura, staged a coup against the APC government of Prime Minister Siaka Stevens. However, he had little support within the army and the coup quickly collapsed. Siaka Stevens knew of the plan before it went into action against him, and it was Momoh who informed him of the plot. Siaka Stevens therefore developed a counterplan to the coup. As a result, Brigadier General John Amadou Bangura's coup turned out to be short-lived. Soldiers loyal to Siaka Stevens, drawn heavily from the 1st Battalion commanded by Momoh, managed to arrest the force commander Brigadier General John Amadou Bangura and officers who adhered to the attempted putsch. Subsequently, 9 officers were brought to trial on charges of mutiny and incitement to mutiny by violence. Brigadier General John Amadou Bangura and 3 others were sentenced to death and executed. An army corporal, Fode Sanko, was among those who were tried for the failed coup, and he was sentenced to a 7-year prison term. During his time in prison, Fode Sanko harbored a deep resentment against the APC regime in general, as well as against Joseph Saidu Momoh, who Fode Sanko accused of having betrayed the executed Brigadier General John Amadou Bangura. Following the execution of the force commander, Brigadier General John Amadou Bangura, Siaka Stevens appointed Momoh as force commander as a reward for his loyalty and efforts in putting down the attempted coup of Brigadier General John Amadou Bangura. In the same year of 1971, the country adopted a new constitution, transforming Sierra Leone into a presidential republic with Siaka Stevens as the first executive president. Momoh was appointed force commander at a time when the morale of the army was low following several disturbances within its ranks. He had the formidable task of reorganizing the army, making it responsible to the people and rebuilding its faith in itself. As force commander, he was awarded the insignia of Officer of the British Empire in the same year of 1971. He was promoted to the rank of brigadier in 1973. President Siaka Stevens, recognizing the significant role Momoh was playing in the development of the country and his success in ensuring that order and discipline returned to the army, invested him with the insignia of Officer of the Order of the Rokel in the first batch of national honors and awards in 1974. In November of the same year, he took a seat in Parliament as nominated member and became Minister of State with cabinet status. In 1978, Siaka Stevens declared Sierra Leone a one-party state with the APC to be the sole legally recognized party. All other political parties were banned, including the main opposition, the Sierra Leone People's Party, the SLPP. The one-party constitution made provision for 2 vice presidents and does away with the office of prime minister. The one-party constitution also provided in clear terms the process of succession from one president to another. It stipulated that on the death, resignation of the head of state, or when he could no longer discharge his duties, he would be succeeded by the first vice president, who would be in office for 90 days, after which period an election could then be held for a leader. In the case of the death or impediment of the first vice president, the succession passed to the second vice president. In 1983, Momoh became Major General of the Republic of Sierra Leone Military Forces, the highest-ranking officer and the first of its kind in the military history of Sierra Leone. As force commander, Momoh saw to it that conditions in the army were improved and embarked upon modernizing the army. He encouraged officers and men of the armed forces to pursue further academic and military courses and engage in productive ventures for the benefit of the whole country. Soon, the military were engaged in farming and road and bridge building. Away from the barracks, Momoh was actively involved in the life of the community. He was a keen sport enthusiast. As a young man, he played for the famous Youngsters of Makeni and later played outside left for for mighty Blackpool in First Division League matches. He also played tennis, volleyball, and basketball. He was also president of Sierra Leone Amateur Football Association, and for 10 years he was president of Blackpool Football Club, for which he was also life patron. He was also president of the Sierra Leone Boxing Association and was at one time president of the Referees Association. As the 1980s wore on, the increasingly regular social unrest undermined both the political power and the personal confidence of Siaka Stevens, who was by then well into the 8th decade of his life. The Sierra Leonean president found himself increasingly isolated by the momentum of history as friends, allies, and other colleagues among the first generation of post-colonial African leaders receded from the scene. Some, like Léopold Sédar Senghor of Senegal, who led his West African nation to independence from France in 1960, resigned his position as president in December 1980 and moved to France and settled into a new life as a man of letters and an acclaimed member of the French Academy. Amadou Ahidjo resigned as president of Cameroon in 1982 after governing for the first 22 years of independence, and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania retired with honor as president in 1985 and returned to his farmstead. Others, like Guinea's Sékou Touré, died peacefully while still in office. Still others, like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and William Tolbert of Liberia, had been overthrown. In fact, Tolbert's violent death by disembowelment at the hands of Master Sergeant Samuel Doe and his mutineers in the coup d'etat of April 12, 1980, profoundly shocked Siaka Stevens, who considered the slain Liberian leader a friend. Hence, Siaka Stevens began to prepare his own departure from 1982 with the construction of a lavish retirement villa. Under the one-party constitutional provisions enacted in 1978 on the death, resignation, or incapacity of the president, the first vice president would succeed him as acting head of state for a period of 90 days, after which period an election could then be held for a leader. In the case of the death or impediment of the first vice president, the succession passed to the second vice president. The first vice president, Sorie Ibrahim Koroma, commonly known as S.I. Koroma, was one of the founding members of the APC and a most loyal political lieutenant to Siaka Stevens. He was credited for having invented the 99 tactics for winning elections, and these included thuggery and the display of excessive violence and intimidation committed against political opponents, especially at elections. He was reputed as being willing to comply with any instructions Siaka Stevens gave and to do what it took to win elections. He was not known to have compunction in such matters. He was easily the most dreaded of the APC functionaries. He had served successively as Minister of Trade and Industry from 1968 to 1969, and Minister of Agriculture and Natural Resources from 1969 to 1971. And when the Republican government of Sierra Leone was established in 1971, he became Vice President and Prime Minister, and he subsequently held the Finance Minister's portfolio from 1975. After the declaration of a one-party state in 1978, which made provision for 2 vice presidents, and does away with the office of Prime Minister, he became first Vice President. S.I. Koroma was generally regarded as the anointed successor to Siaka Stevens, both because of the provision of the Constitution on the matter, and because of his standing in his political party and commitment to its course and loyalty to Siaka Stevens. Unfortunately, S.I. Koroma had been involved in a gruesome accident in 1977. By the time Siaka Stevens was preparing his departure from office, S.I. Koroma had not recovered fully. His health and effectiveness had been impaired thereby, but he was still performing his duties as first vice president. While S.I. Koroma's loyalty to Siaka Stevens was unimpeachable, the extent of the president's confidence in his deputy was nonetheless more reserved. There were indications that Siaka Stevens favored the next candidate in the presidential succession, Christian Alusine Camara Taylor, popularly known as C.A. Camara Taylor, who was also a founding member of the APC, who had served successively as Minister of Lands, Mines and Labor from 1968 to 1971, Finance Minister from 1971 to 1975, and Prime Minister from 1975 to 1978, before acceding to the newly created office of Second Vice President in 1978, after the declaration of a one-party state which made provision for 2 vice presidents and does away with the office of Prime Minister. In addition to their political ties, the ties between Siaka Stevens and Camara Taylor had been reinforced by their arrest for sedition during the tense days of 1961, when the latter had pleaded guilty in order to exonerate the former. Fate, however, was unkind to Kamara Taylor, who, in mid-1984, was stricken by a neurological disorder from which he never fully recovered before his death the following March. Kamara Taylor was succeeded by the Attorney General and Minister of Justice Francis Minna as second vice president. Francis Minna, a Southerner, was a newcomer to the APC from the outlawed SLPP. Francis Minna eventually became one of Siaka Stevens' most trusted political lieutenants. Aside from being one of Siaka Stevens' most trusted lieutenant, Francis Minna was related to Siaka Stevens maternally. With the blessing of Siaka Stevens, Francis Minna became a political force to reckon with, not only in the southeast of the country but in the whole country. In his successor, Siaka Stevens sought not only a candidate who would preserve the stability of the political order he had imposed upon Sierra Leone, but perhaps even more importantly, would also be the least likely to dig into the past for any misconduct during the present administration. S.I. Koroma, seen by many as a Machiavellian politician, would not hesitate to sacrifice Siaka Stevens on the political altar to win the love and support of the people. But most importantly, Siaka Stevens was convinced that S.I. Koroma's succession would have further polarized the country's politics into Southeast Mende and Northwest Temne. Eventually, out of the blues, the president's choice fell on the Armed Forces Commander, Major General Joseph Saidu Momoh, who was also a sitting member of parliament and whose support had been critical throughout Siaka Stevens' rule. The whole country went into pocket debates in corners that Siaka Stevens was protecting his life by making sure that his successor would not prosecute him, by bringing him to justice to account for all he did during his misrule of power and human rights abuses. There were a few theories why S.I. Koroma was not to succeed Siaka Stevens. One school of thought was that Siaka Stevens did not trust S.I. Koroma to secure his retirement. Also, it was believed that Siaka Stevens did not view him as a strong leader, as S.I. Koroma had suffered debilitating injuries in a car crash in 1977 that affected his health. There was also a perception that choosing a military man as his successor would forestall a military coup that might have dragged Siaka Stevens before a military commission to answer for his misdeeds. It was also believed that since it was Momoh who exposed the executed former army commander, Brigadier General John Amadu Bangura's coup plot to Siaka Stevens, which resulted in the trial and execution of Brigadier General John Amadu Bangura. Siaka Stevens, it can be said, wished to reward him for his loyalty. As a result, Siaka Stevens selected Major General Joseph Saidu Momoh, who was a trusted confidant of his, as the man to take over the baton. Although Momoh had been an appointed member of parliament since 1974, as a soldier, Momoh was prohibited from engaging in national politics as such. Moreover, the constitution clearly provided for presidential succession and the holding of elections within a definite period. Nonetheless, undeterred as he had always been by legal technicalities, Siaka Stevens offered Momoh the presidency during a meeting in December 1984. After several meetings, Momoh was initially uncertain of the president's intentions and worried about being put in one of the well-known traps laid by an old man given to suspicions about coups and other conspiracies. Momoh accepted, and Siaka Stevens set about preparing the way, much to the chagrin of the party members and other Sierra Leoneans alike. Notwithstanding Siaka Stevens' maneuver, he had to push through parliament a bill to amend the constitution so that Joseph Saidu Momoh would succeed him. In order to legally manipulate the constitution, Siaka Stevens used his second vice president, Francis Minna, who was a trained lawyer. Francis Minna orchestrated the constitutional amendments necessary for President Siaka Stevens to pass over his first vice president, S.I. Koroma, and make Momoh his successor. On July 24, 1985, a motion was tabled in Parliament amending the constitution to pass the presidential succession to a presidential council consisting of the two vice presidents, the Attorney General, the Speaker of Parliament, and the leader of the APC, instead of to the first vice president directly. The legislation, with some amendments, passed with only 2 abstentions and a single vote against, cast by Finance Minister Abdoulaye Conte, who was subsequently dismissed from the cabinet for voting against the legislation. First Vice President S.I. Koroma was thus robbed of his guaranteed succession. In August 1985, delegates of the APC met at the Bintumani Conference Hall in Freetown and elected Joseph Saidu Momoh, who had resigned his military commission, the leader and secretary general of the ruling party. In a final humiliation of his long loyal deputy, Siaka Stevens got no other person than S.I. Koroma, who had stuck his neck out throughout Siaka Stevens' rule to manipulate elections, to move the motion to appoint Joseph Saidu Momoh as head of the party. This was a painful moment for the strong man and loyal soldier of Siaka Stevens. It was quite a bitter pill to swallow, as S.I. Koroma wept bitterly, as he had always seen and regarded himself as the natural successor to Siaka Stevens. The tears shedding S.I. Koroma thereby nominate the man who walked into the inheritance that he had long assumed would be his. The following year, S.I. Koroma retired from politics and returned to his farm in his hometown to devote himself to his palm oil trade. The nomination was seconded by the second vice president, Francis Minna. Thereafter, Francis Minna was very active in Momoh's nationwide campaign for endorsement, which resulted in Momoh automatically becoming the sole presidential candidate for the presidential election fixed for October 1, 1985. After going through the party procedures, Momoh had to be presented to the nation. He had to be elected as president by the people. As Sierra Leone was a one-party state at the time, he was the sole candidate put forward to the nation. Voters only had the option of approving or rejecting his candidacy. There were jubilation everywhere, but in the army barracks in particular there were great celebrations. Momoh was, however, quick to point out that his government was not going to be a military one, as he was being elected constitutionally. Momoh then retired from the military. To enhance his popularity, Siaka Stevens took him on a nationwide tour during which Siaka Stevens introduced him to the people as his chosen successor. Momoh toured every part of the country to explain his position and proposed policies and canvass the support of the electorates, for according to the constitution, he needed to win a simple majority of the votes cast in order to be legally installed as president. In the limited time at his disposal, Momoh visited all parts of the country on his election campaign. Everywhere Momoh went, he was greeted by wild scenes of enthusiasm and support. The entire nation was poised for a change from the old leadership. Momoh's public presentation soon made him one of the most charismatic figures on the political scene of Sierra Leone since independence. Momoh made glowing speeches of great promise that energized the people, at a time when, because of mismanagement and bad policies, the economy was in the doldrums, and people's welfare was severely hit. Subsequently, when the referendum on his candidacy was held on October 1, 1985, Momoh won by a resounding victory. Momoh's candidacy was approved by over 99% of the vote, with just over 4,000 people voting against. This event is most significant in the history of post-colonial Africa. For the first time, a military head of a nation's armed forces, while still a serving officer, was adopted as a leader of the single political party, and by referendum, voted into power a civilian head of the state. Without using physical force, the military head was constitutionally elected president of the state. On November 27, 1985, Siaka Stevens made a farewell speech to the nation in which he catalogued what he considered his major successes after 17 years of ruling the country. The following day, at an impressive ceremony at the Parliament building in Freetown, Siaka Stevens officially handed the reins of power to Momoh and immediately took his exit. President Momoh then gave an impressive address outlining the policy of his new administration. As soon as the ceremony at the Parliament building was over, President Momoh, who was now Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, proceeded to another ceremony at which he relinquished active command of the army to Brigadier Mohammed Sheku Tarawali, until then Chief of Staff. The Deputy Force Commander when Momoh was Force Commander, Brigadier Sam King, had retired a few days earlier to become presidential aide to Momoh. In his brief handing over speech, Momoh assured the army that he would continue to be interested in their welfare and expected them to give their fullest support to his administration. He exhorted them to give an equal degree of dedicated service to his successor, whom he described as a thoroughly competent and capable officer. In his own equally brief acceptance speech, Brigadier Mohammed Sheku Tarawali assured the head of state that he would maintain the high standards set by Momoh and that the army would give its most unflinching support to the president to ensure the success of his administration. Thus, as 1985 drew to a close, the country witnessed not only an unprecedented change in the political leadership, but also in the command structure of the army. On January 26, 1986, Momoh was formally inaugurated. When Momoh became president, there was enthusiastic and popular support for him and for his presidency. The country was then anxious for a change. Most people thought that because he was a military man, he would clear the mess left by Siaka Stevens and would introduce discipline in the way the government, the country, and the economy were to be run. As a result, there was so much euphoria then, as people thought a savior had come to relieve their burden after 17 years under Siaka Stevens' rule. In his inaugural address as president, Momoh gave a lot of assurances that things would then change for the better. He emphasized the need for accountability and issued a stern warning to those who made it a habit to ignore stipulated rules and regulations by virtue of their standing or connection in society, that their days are numbered. He went on by saying that, henceforth the question will not be who you are, but what you can do. In other words, as from today, your recognition in society will be determined by the contribution you make to its welfare rather than by your assumed air of arrogance. He promised to instill discipline into all aspects of Sierra Leonean life, cut out corruption, bribery, mismanagement, smuggling, hoarding of essential commodities and tax evasion, and resurrect the economy. Momoh named his administration the New Order to symbolize his desire for positive change in the country. He was to introduce the philosophy of constructive nationalism, through which he desired to revive the collapsing state, revitalize the economy, and galvanize Sierra Leoneans towards his political goals. In this way, Sierra Leoneans, including the political class, would become committed to the national cause. The people were impressed with these initial statements and the roadmap he had set for his administration. This inspired great hope and great and high expectation for a better and prosperous Sierra Leone. The initial steps Momoh took were laudable. Like Siaka Stevens, he formed a government, which included persons from all the regions of the country. Not long after his inauguration, he called for parliamentary elections which were held in May 1986. He aimed at having free and fair elections, free from thuggery and violence, which was commonplace in elections within the one-party system of those days. He made rules to ensure the fairness of the elections and prescribed penalties for breach of those rules. The rules were in fact applied against some candidates of the party who infringed the rules. In this respect, Momoh was departing from the well-known and accepted practice of Siaka Stevens and the APC in the conduct of elections, which were always marred by thuggery, violence, and intimidation. Momoh was demonstrating his democratic leanings, which was not shared by his party. Despite these promising beginnings, the Momoh administration soon encountered difficulties which were due, in large part, from the weak foundations on which the preceding government had constructed the APC regime. And Momoh proved to be a laid-back, complacent, weak, and an incompetent leader. For example, under Siaka Stevens, the country's resources were mortgaged to a few Afro-Lebanese businessmen. In summary, before Siaka Stevens assumed power, the legal diamond trade constituted 1/3 of national output and contributed over 70% of Sierra Leone's foreign exchange reserves. By the mid-1980s, however, less than $100,000 worth of the precious minerals passed through legal taxable channels. Most of the rest was appropriated by Siaka Stevens and a coterie of his closest business associates led by General Said Mohammed, an Afro-Lebanese businessman whose national trading company held monopoly rights for the importation of no fewer than 87 commodities and whose financial dealings were apparently protected from government oversight. Siaka Stevens and his associates also embezzled profits and other assets from various state enterprises, including the oil and rice monopolies. They likewise used the authority of government to undermine any private competition. Consequently, they destroyed the effectiveness of most state institutions, starving them of formal sources of revenue and turning them into extensions of their private patronage networks. General Said Mohammed had extensive contracts with Siaka Stevens. He became a shareholder in the diamond mining company, Diaminco, shipped loads of diamonds out of the country. Siaka Stevens essentially ceded the diamond industry to General Said Mohammed, with official exports of diamonds reduced from slightly above 500,000 carats in 1980 to below 50,000 carats in 1988. As a business partner of Siaka Stevens, he had the control of the manufacturing industries, insurance, and marketing. Thus, although General Said Mohammed was not a government official, he wielded a lot of political power. Imagine giving acquiescence or approval to official government appointments at both ministerial and civil service levels. Going beyond the pale, imagine this businessman, General Said Mohammed, who was not a member of the Siaka Stevens cabinet, nor the bank governor, nor any of its officials for that matter, setting the price of the exchange rate. When the government was cash-strapped, such a businessman was the first port of call for short-term loans. Doing business legitimately or otherwise became a costly affair, so much so that small businesses were crowded out of the market, and only businessmen with large financial capital were able to survive. In considering the way and manner business was being undertaken, someone had to bear the cost of all this, usually the consumers, because of shifting of these costs to the consumers and the state, and the revenue base contracted. To all intents and purposes, the president or perhaps the political class connived with private business, more especially Jamil Sahid Mohammed, to operate a shadow state or informal market at the expense of state-run institutions. As a result, individuals came to understand that an appointment to a government position was the key to accessing both formal and informal state resources through embezzlement, bribery, and other corrupt practices. For Stevens, sitting at the top of this corrupt pyramid, the authority to appoint became a means of rewarding loyalty and punishing dissent. When Momoh assumed power, the economy was crumbling, not being able to rein in the rampant corruption that permeated the system and the blatant smuggling of Sierra Leone's mineral wealth, presided over by some influential Lebanese, the likes of Jamil Mohammed, who had the freedom to operate illegally under Siaka Stevens. The country was almost bankrupted, and this became evident in the shortages of consumer goods, food, and fuel. Under Momoh's regime, there were shortages of fuel, delayed payments of public servant salaries, and spiraling inflation. Furthermore, under Siaka Stevens, no matter was too insignificant for the attention of the incumbent president, who fancied himself Pa Sheki, the father of his fellow countrymen. That Siaka Stevens had survived the crisis attendant to more than 17 years at the helm of the state was a tribute to the success of his policy of co-opting any potential rivals who might threaten to his continued rule, using constitutional provisions that empowered him to directly appoint up to 7 members to parliament. In addition, members whose election he secured in the one-party state by nominating them as the APC's candidates for specific constituencies. Siaka Stevens managed to buy out most opponents, but at the cost of weakening Sierra Leonean society's capacity for dialogue over political and economic differences. For example, the leadership of the Sierra Leone Labour Congress, the country's principal labor union, was closely tied to that of the governing APC, hence ensuring relative calm in the labor market. This alliance was threatened in early 1980s when the Sierra Leone Labour Congress was led by the committed trade unionist James Kabia. In 1983, the government secured Kabia's dismissal and the appointment of the president's brother-in-law, Ibrahim Langley, as the new head of the Sierra Leone Labour Congress. That same year, the new Sierra Leone Labour Congress leader sabotaged his own fellow unionists in negotiations with the government and thus earned his appointment to parliament. At the same time, the restlessness of the teachers' union came to an end when its president was likewise seconded into the legislature. Compounding the lack of vibrant social and political institutions that constitute a country's civil society, Siaka Stevens also abolished the local government system and centralized all decision-making to the central government in Freetown, thereby eliminating the emergency of strong opinion formers at the local level, who might be threats to his authority. Power and resources were concentrated in Freetown while local infrastructure and services including roads, health clinics, and schools collapsed. During the first years of the country's independence, local government institutions flourished. In part, this was the legacy of British colonial policy, which favored indirect rule of the then protectorate, now known as the provinces, through local traditional chieftains. Under the successive ministries of the country's 2 first prime ministers, aside from the special administrations of Freetown and the Western area, Sierra Leone was divided into 3 provinces, Northern, Eastern, and Southern, which were subdivided into 12 districts, each headed by a district officer appointed by the central government. Each district officer, however, was assisted by a locally elected district council. In addition, the area of the former protectorate was divided into chiefdoms, each headed by a paramount chief, chosen for life from traditional chiefly lineages by chiefdom councillors who, in turn, were elected by taxpayers within the territory of the chiefdom. Each chiefdom was, in turn, divided into sections presided over by a section chief. The district councils were suspended by the military regime of 1967, and formally abolished by the APC government in 1973. At the same time, Siaka Stevens simply abolished all the local government structures except for that of the paramount chieftains, whose importance was diminished by the imposition of the single-party state. Consequently, the importance of the chieftaincy as an institution declined, especially when candidates under the one-party rule were chosen by the central government. Eventually, APC-connected candidates were elected unchallenged to the chieftaincy without even belonging to traditional chiefly families. Beginning in 1975, Siaka Stevens further undermined the institution by decreeing that incumbent chiefs had to submit to re-election every 4 years. Using ethnic rivalries as a pretense, Siaka Stevens gradually subordinated local government to the central government, both through formal abolition and informal diminution of both revenues and functions. As a result, by the mid-1980s, even mundane basic services such as waste removal, the maintenance of public latrines, and the supervision of markets had been centralized into various and often overlapping national ministerial jurisdictions. While the City Council of Freetown, a special administration under the Constitution, managed to hold on to local autonomy during most of Siaka Stevens' rule, by the time that Momoh assumed power, even the capital was plagued by this deprivation of independence and resources, and therefore suffered a diminution in the scope of service deliveries and the depth of performance. And it became obvious to even ordinary citizens that politics, in particular political insecurity, on the part of the APC regime had stifled efficiency, local autonomy, and the culture of political participation. One of the reasons that it was believed that Momoh had been selected to succeed Siaka Stevens was that Momoh enjoyed some authority within the military, virtually the only state institution that retained any significant organizational identity, and thus would have a greater probability of holding the country together. Unfortunately, upon closer scrutiny, this perceived advantage actually meant less than it appeared at the first glance. Siaka Stevens, with his experience of the coups and counter-coups, feared of the military's potential for mischief. His response had been not only to involve the army and police in national decision-making through the appointment of their respective commanders to parliament and to the cabinet, but to also limit the Sierra Leone Army's strength to no more than 2,000 recruits, relying instead on loyal paramilitary units like the Internal Security Unit, the ISU, later changed to the Special Security Division, the SSD, which was better equipped than the National Army and the APC's youth cadres. Back to President Momoh. After the 1986 parliamentary elections, Momoh, the beleaguered leader, retained in his government a number of the old guards, the ministers in the former regime of Siaka Stevens. Later, the Inspector General of Police, James Bambe Kamara, and the force commander, Mohammed Sheku Tarawali, who had already been promoted to Major General, were nominated to Parliament and to the Cabinet. He also appointed Francis Mina as First Vice President and Attorney General and Minister of Justice, perhaps as a reward for his support at the party conference and during the endorsement campaign. The people were disappointed with the appointments when they started seeing that Momoh's appointment as president did not make a break with the past as was expected. When Momoh became president, he appeared genuinely determined to effect an improvement, but he was inhibited by his personal weaknesses and the situation he inherited together with the political milieu with which he was operating. He was inept at managing a government. There were the entrenched habits and the anti-democratic forces in the APC within which he had to work. The economic situations he inherited did not improve cooperation between his administration and international financial institutions and bilateral donors. He was not able to control his ministers and other officials and get them to do the right things or refrain from doing the wrong things. They did what they wanted to do and what suited them, even if that was contrary to the declared policy of the president. He was unwilling or unable to take appropriate actions against them in those circumstances. Sometimes they took decisions and actions on crucial matters without his knowledge or consent. In short, he lacked leadership qualities and he was notoriously lax on policy. In this respect, Momoh's attitude to government can be contrasted to that of Siaka Stevens. Siaka Stevens, being the true autocrat he was, had full control over his ministers and always knew what was going on in the ministries and in the country. Because of the above weaknesses, Momoh failed to perform as expected and the economic and social conditions of the people and the country deteriorated further. Momoh had inherited a moribund economy. in which most of the state institutions were not functioning and foreign assistance was being withdrawn, and the activities the assistance was supporting, such as the integrated agricultural projects, were winding up. Unemployment at all levels was very high. Inflation was running at over 600%. Siaka Stevens had dodged the International Monetary Fund, the IMF prescription of Structural Adjustment Program, known as the SAP, which included the further devaluation of the Leone, reduction of the national wage bill, and removal of subsidies on rice and fuel. The IMF made their continued support conditional on the acceptance of the SAP. After some reluctance, Momoh's Minister of Finance, Dr. Shekhar Kanu, started implementing the SAP. As a result, there was a huge increase in the prices of these commodities. The huge increase in the cost of living and the resulting hardship provoked nationwide disturbances. Dr. Shekhar Kanu was replaced by Hassan Kanu as Minister of Finance. He was willing to slow down or ignore the implementation of the SAP. This further deteriorated the relationship between the IMF, the donors, and the government. It was under these conditions that Momoh had to operate. Amidst fanfare, Momoh introduced the Green Revolution Program, the GRP. This was a short-term, 2-year program, and it was a strategy to make the agricultural sector more productive. It aimed at achieving food production and providing proper incentive to farmers and rallying the rural masses for development. It was a very laudable program, but it depended heavily on foreign support. Both the 2-year duration of the Green Revolution program and the reliance on foreign support for funding that program was unrealistic in the circumstance that then prevailed. There had been decadence in the agricultural sector for long. It therefore required a prolonged period to reactivate it. Again, because of the government's failure to implement the IMF SAP, there was no enthusiastic foreign support for the Green Revolution program. There was lack of enthusiasm from ministers, MPs, and high-ranking officials for the program to succeed. They were benefiting a lot from the food aid from the American Public Law 480 program, the European Economic Community, and Italian commodity aid. From these, 250 bags of rice would be given to ministers and MPs for distribution to their constituents, but they sold the rice in Freetown. The Minister of Trade and State Enterprises, Ben Kanu, was himself a key importer of rice. Because of what they stood to lose if the Green Revolution program succeeded, the ministers were unwilling or not enthusiastic to support the Green Revolution program, and it failed. This marked the beginning of the grand failures of the Momoh New Order regime. The government established the National Aid Coordinating Secretariat, the NACS, to oversee the distribution of the proceeds of sale of rice to the farmers. But rice obtained through the American Public Law 480 scheme was distributed to appointed agents, who in turn sold it to traders or business associates in Freetown. The agents were expected to surrender to the NACS the proceeds from the sale of the American Public Law 480 rice, but many never did. A company belonging to the Minister of Trade and State Enterprises, Ben Kanu, received about 40% of the rice. The rice was even popularly referred to as Ben Kanu rice. Thus, rice, like in Siaka Stevens' time, became a political commodity, an important resource in patron-client relationships. The NACS was to give the proceeds of the sale of the rice to farmers as loan based on their holdings, assessed, and their potential to benefit from the loan before they were qualified for the loans. But a big syndicate existed at the NACS. Most of the beneficiaries of the loans turned out to be government ministers and high-ranking party officials or friends or relatives of staff at NACS. Almost overnight, most of the beneficiaries of the loans, who had hardly visited the provinces, claimed falsely to have acres of land in remote areas of the provinces. Thus, genuine farmers became disadvantaged. They could not easily travel to Freetown, and because of the abuses associated with the granting of the loans. In this way, the American Public Law 480 scheme, like the Green Revolution program, did not improve the socio-economic conditions of the farmers. Instead, it only made the politicians richer. For 2 years into Momoh's regime, Sierra Leoneans hoped in vain to see positive changes in their conditions. The improvements which they expected to come as a result of the new order regime they had warmly welcomed were not forthcoming. They started losing faith in Momoh's ability to govern. The constructive nationalism philosophy, which Momoh had introduced, which was to revitalize the economy and galvanize the people towards a common goal, was not practiced even by his own ministers. In 1986, Former President Siaka Stevens' business associate, the Afro-Lebanese Jamil Sahid Mohammed, was instrumental in persuading Momoh in hosting a state visit by Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO chairman Yasser Arafat, exiled to Tunis after his humiliating defeat by the Israeli forces in Lebanon. The purpose of Arafat's visit was to secure a deal with Momoh to run a Palestinian paramilitary training camp on one of the islands off Sierra Leone's coast. Arafat offered the cash-strapped President Momoh $8 million in exchange for the use of an island as a training base for his exiled fighters. While Momoh eventually caved to Western pressure and officially turned down the offer, he did allow Jamil Sahid Mohammed to maintain a 500-man personal security force, consisting primarily of Palestinians driven out of Lebanon, which effectively enabled the Palestinian leader to achieve the same end of finding a base to keep his fighters together. As it turned out, the Arafat visit was the apogee of Jamil Sahid Mohammed's reign as the eminence grise of the APC regime. By 1987, Sierra Leoneans had lost total confidence in the Momoh regime and started calling him names. The failure of leadership had now become noticeable. The government found it difficult to pay teachers and other public workers' salaries. Civil servants, who had access to public funds, started helping themselves without compunction. There was rampant addition of ghost workers to the government payroll, for whom wages were collected. Teacher strikes and go-slow action caused a lot of school-going youths to lose interest in the school system, and there was an influx of young unemployed school leavers roaming the towns, including mining towns. Parents who could afford sent their children to private schools. Education then became the preserve of a select few. Momoh then declared that education was a privilege and not a right for everyone. As infrastructure and public ethics deteriorated in tandem, much of Sierra Leone's professional class fled the country. Student disturbances became frequent. As a result of the suppression of the growing students' demonstrations, youth radicalism gained ground. Some of these youths became attracted to Muammar Gaddafi's revolution and revolutionary ideas. They became the vanguard of the Sierra Leone Rebel War, which started in 1991. On March 23, 1987, Sierra Leonean security services foiled a plot to assassinate President Momoh and overthrow the government. Acting apparently on information received from a conspirator who defected, government forces raided a private residence in the West End area of Freetown and, after a brief battle, arrested a number of plotters and uncovered a large cache of guns, explosives, and other arms, as well as communications equipment and uniforms. In all, more than 60 suspects were arrested, while others went into exile. Among those implicated in the failed coup d'etat was none other than Momoh's own first vice president and attorney general and minister of justice, Francis Mina. A total of 18 persons were implicated. They included a senior police officer, Gabriel Mohammed Tennyson Kaikai, who prior to his arrest was an assistant superintendent at the New Englandville police station in Freetown, having been demoted from his rank of superintendent. Another prominent figure implicated in the failed coup d'etat was the Afro-Lebanese businessman, Jamil Sahid Mohammed, who was out of the country at the time that the conspiracy was uncovered, and he eventually went into exile for the rest of Momoh's rule. Francis Mina, Gabriel Mohammed Tennyson Kaikai, along with 3 other conspirators, were eventually hung for treason in October 1989. Suffice it to say here that there had developed a bond of friendship between Francis Mina and Momoh. Francis Mina's meteoric rise in the APC hierarchy resulted in a lot of jealousy against him, especially as he was a newcomer to the party from the SLPP and he was a Southerner. He was therefore viewed as an outsider enjoying the benefits on offer by the APC. The desire to put a halt to his rise was strong among senior and long-standing members of the party. Gabriel Mohammed Tennyson Kaikai too had for some time not been on the best of terms with his boss, James Bambe Kamara, the Inspector General of Police. Kaikai had even at one time appeared before a disciplinary committee on a charge of insubordination by him towards James Bambe Kamara. The charge preferred against Francis Mina created a great challenge for Momoh, having regard to the relationship that existed between the two men. But the decision to charge Minister had been spearheaded by the Inspector General of Police, James Bambe Kamara, whom Momoh did not have the courage to question. So the trial proceeded to conclusion. Nevertheless, Francis Mina was of the view that Momoh wholeheartedly believed in his innocence, and that in any event he would not sign a death warrant for Francis Mina's execution. Francis Mina held this belief very strongly even when he was a condemned prisoner at the Pademba Road prison in Freetown after his conviction. Because of this belief, it required a lot of persuasion from his legal team that he should prepare his last will, for whatever it was worth. He agreed to do so only reluctantly. It turned out that he was executed on a warrant signed by Momoh. By 1988, Sierra Leone was descending into insolvency due to growing foreign debt, rampant inflation, currency devaluation, budget deficits, and grand corruption and declining exports. Every attempt so far made by the Momoh regime to reverse the situation had failed. The efforts were invariably frustrated by his ministers and other high-ranking officials or senior party functionaries, and sometimes with the complicity of the president himself. He failed or refused to act appropriately, timely and robustly to ensure the success of his government's economic policies. The failure of the Green Revolution program and the American Public Law 480 scheme was largely due mainly to his poor leadership, his neglect and inaction. At the same time, diplomats, governments, and other high-ranking officials and party functionaries were fueling this already deplorable situation by their entering into contracts and other shady deals, which were both ridiculous and patently criminal. Government incurred huge liabilities as a result of those contracts, and public funds or public property were utilized in settling those liabilities. For example, in 1988, Sierra Leonean Development Company, which was a private Sierra Leonean company, engaged in the importation of rice-ordered rice valued $9.3 million from Philip Brothers Limited, a prominent international commodities trading firm. The company, unable to pay, requested the government to pay for the consignment, but the rice was to be sold to the public by Sierra Leonean. The government accepted this arrangement and instructed the Sierra Leone Produce Marketing Board (SLPMB), which was not a party to the contract, to pay for the rice. SLPMB was not able to pay the money and offered instead to pay in kind by giving cocoa and coffee. Meanwhile, the monopoly of SLPMB over the export of cocoa and coffee was removed by government and, as a result, SLPMB was not able to supply the produce to Philip Brothers Limited. Further, the government took an additional loan of $5 million from Philip Brothers Limited. The government failed to pay and Philip Brothers resorted to court action against the government. The company sued the Sierra Leone government in London for failing to pay a legitimate debt. The action resulted in the freezing of the Sierra Leone government's assets in Britain and France. The Sierra Leone High Commission in London had all its bank accounts frozen. Remittances for the payment of salaries and wages to staff of the High Commission in London were done through the bank accounts of private individuals in London. On a visit to London, an APC member of parliament at the time almost had his €2,000 check seized by HSBC Bank in London, on information that he was an agent for the government of Sierra Leone. This created national embarrassment. President Momoh was personally interested in and authorized the award of a contract to a Chinese company for the upgrading of the facilities of the Sierra Leone Ports Authority and for the provision of badly needed equipment. The entire project was never accomplished, but the deal cost the government 400 million Leone and an additional $3 million. Seletti, an Italian company, was authorized to extract timber from the Gola forest in eastern Sierra Leone. The company was incurring losses and decided to sell the business to the government of Sierra Leone for $1,450,000. The government agreed but made payment of only $50,000 and failed to pay the balance of the debt. By December 1990, the debt and accrued interest amounted to $3,478,000. La Marca, the owner of the Italian company, sued the government in an Italian court. As a result of that action, the Italian government blocked the sum of $100 million it had pledged for the construction of the Bumbuna Hydro Dam, the country's first hydroelectric dam. In settlement of the debt, the government offered the Sierra Leone Embassy building in Rome to La Marca. After possessing the building, La Marca was so pleased with the arrangement that he gave back the sum of $300,000 to the government. In 1989, Tom Cargbo, Sierra Leone's permanent representative to the United Nations, took a loan of $2.5 million from Barclays Bank in New York and used the Sierra Leone Embassy building in New York as collateral. He did so without reference to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Freetown. He then bought a substandard building to be used as embassy building and pocketed a large slice of the remaining amount. In relation to that transaction, he failed to give any explanation or answer any query from the Minister of Foreign Affairs or even from the cabinet. He did so because he had the protection of Bambe Kamara, the Inspector General of Police, who refused to take any action against the ambassador. James Bambe Kamara was then so powerful in the government that even the president could not challenge his decisions. He was even thought to have been running the country since Momoh was elected president in 1985. The ambassador was therefore not called to account. When Barclays Bank threatened to take legal action to recover its money, the government sold the embassy building in New York to a Swiss company, Noga. The government already owed Noga a huge debt for oil supplies. Momoh's approach dovetailed with the policy concerns of Israel and its allies, who had grown increasingly concerned with the ties between Sierra Leone's Lebanese businessmen and various factions in the Middle Eastern conflict in general, and the funding of armed anti-Israeli militias in Lebanon in particular. Sierra Leone had broken diplomatic relations with Israel in 1973, when an attack on the Jewish state by Syria and Egypt led to the Israeli occupation of the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. Siaka Stevens had interpreted the occupation of the peninsula as a colonial occupation of African territory because the Sinai belonged to a member state of Organization of African Unity, OAU, Egypt. Siaka Stevens broke diplomatic ties with Israel and aligned his country with the Arab cause, the secular and socialist orientations of Arab nationalism of the time being very much in accord with his own politics. Hence, Momoh sought closer ties with Israeli interests in his bid to end Lebanese dominance. This was encouraged by Israel, which was eager to cut off Lebanese funding for anti-Israeli armed factions in the Middle East. One of the first Israeli firms to come on the scene was Liat Finance and Construction, led by Shabtai Kalmanovich, a Russian-born Israeli national. While the company's entry into the Sierra Leonean market was ostensibly occasioned by government development contracts that it promised to underwrite, including a low-cost housing scheme for Freetown that never materialized, its interest was quickly focused on mining and marketing diamonds through official taxable channels. Momoh assented to the switch since he found a private monopoly answerable to him preferable to the present arrangement over which he exercised little control. At first, the stratagem seemed to work. The Israeli firm opened a diamond buying office in the capital, and in the first year alone, the quantity of legal diamonds exported from Sierra Leone nearly quadrupled. To facilitate his dealings, Kalmanovich was even given a diplomatic passport by the government of Sierra Leone, which attested to his being a cultural attaché. However, a shadier side to the enterprise was soon revealed as some of Kalmanovich's more questionable associates became involved. Marat Balangula, the alleged godfather of Russian organized crime in Brooklyn, New York, found refuge in Sierra Leone and began operating with Kalmanovich. The two became involved in the importation of petroleum into the West African country, in a scheme reportedly backed by American businessman Mark Rich, who was a fugitive from the United States until his pardon in the waning days of President Bill Clinton's presidency, and the Lucchese crime family, an Italian-American mafia crime family, and one of the 5 families that dominate organized crime activities in New York City and New Jersey within the nationwide criminal phenomenon known as the American Mafia. Other partners that Kalmanovich brought into his Sierra Leonean ventures included Boris Biba Neifeld, a Russian mobster who was later imprisoned for 4 years on U.S. federal drug trafficking charges for running heroin between Thailand and New York, and Rachmil Mike Brandwin, a reputed figure in the Antwerp underground. Shady Israeli enterprises like Liat companies were used by the apartheid-era South African government to facilitate arms and other purchases and sell South African gems in defiance of international sanctions. Liat Company is alleged to have shipped South African gems to Europe and America as being stones originating in Sierra Leone, importing in return banned cargoes for the apartheid regime using Sierra Leone as the listed destination. For his cooperation, Momoh not only achieved a partial disruption of the hold that illegal miners and their Lebanese patrons had on Sierra Leone's resources, but also received payoffs that he distributed to subordinates and other supplicants. The arrangement, however, fell apart when Kalmanovich was arrested in late 1987 on an American warrant for fraud while traveling to London. After serving 6 months in a North Carolina prison, he was extradited to Israel where he was arrested on charges of spying for the Soviet Union and jailed until 1993. Kalmanovic's arrest brought about the collapse of Liat's operations in Sierra Leone. Its market position was soon taken up by another Israeli firm, the SIPA Group, a somewhat less shady outfit that came to Sierra Leone in 1989. Owned by Nirguaz known as the Skipper, SIPA earned its way into Momoh's favor by paying on the president's behalf long overdue salaries to civil servants and lending the government funds with which to pay some of its past due debts to international creditors, thus permitting Sierra Leone to restart negotiations with the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, in 1989. The latter was a not insignificant favor since Sierra Leone had been previously excluded from the Paris Club negotiations over debt reduction because of its failure to service its debts. In fact, the creditors did not look particularly askance at the Momoh government's reliance on foreign firms, convinced that the main obstacle to servicing its foreign debt was the hold on the diamond wealth exercised by rogue officials and Lebanese business interests that it inherited from the Siaka Stevens regime. The creditors actually needed the foreign firms to generate the state revenues from which they could receive repayments. The IMF, for one, was impressed enough to offer, in 1990, the prospect of $500 million at a time when the Sierra Leonean economy was generating less than $1 billion a year, of which the government is estimated to have netted barely $50 million. Like Liat Company, however, SIPA Group did not actually get involved in mining directly. Rather, through offices it opened in Freetown and Kenema, the firm purchased its stones from illegal miners who actually worked the diamond fields. While the SIPA Group rescued the Momoh regime out of its financial difficulties in mid-1989, its own commercial interests diverged from the political goals of the government. In its pursuit of ties with the miners who controlled its access to the diamonds, SIPA Group not only paid better prices than its Lebanese competitors, but it also gave gifts to Momoh's rivals as well as his allies. The firm was also suspected of purchasing its diamonds for export as part of a scheme to launder drug money. Losing his patience, Momoh arrested the owner Nirguaz on Christmas Eve 1989, charging him with economic sabotage before deporting him, thus bringing SIPA's Sierra Leonean venture to an end. Despite their somewhat seedy reputations and rather questionable business practices, including the financing of both legal and illegal diamond exports, the Israeli firms were generally viewed more favorably than the Lebanese and Afro-Lebanese traders who had been in the country longer. They paid far better prices to miners for their finds, and they imported rice and machinery which they sold at affordable prices. The Lebanese, many of whom were or claimed to be Sierra Leonean by birth, did the opposite, paying below market prices for gems and hoarding consumer commodities to drive up prices. Indeed, so popular did SIPA Group become that it was believed that some Lebanese schemed with corrupt police officials to have the company driven out of the country, which eventually led to the arrest of SIPA Group's boss, Nirguaz, who was arrested by the Sierra Leone government on fake currency-related charges, detained and then deported. The Lebanese mogul Jamil Sahid Mohammed had by then gone into self-exile after the foiled coup plot of 1987, but the plot against SIPA Group was contrived by his close associates in Freetown. These represents only some of the shady and corrupt deals in which Momoh and his ministers and party functionaries were involved at home and abroad. Such contracts and transactions contributed to Sierra Leone becoming and being regarded as the poorest country on earth. The high hopes Momoh had held out at his inauguration, and the great expectations the people had had that his regime would turn things around for them, and the country were dashed. The people gave him up and became resigned to their fate. They became further disenchanted by his regime and by the embarrassment it caused the country at home and abroad. However, Momoh was able to establish the College of Medicine and Allied Health Sciences in 1988 to train medical doctors. He also established the Sierra Leone Law School in 1989 for the children of the downtrodden to be lawyers. Before Momoh, lawyers were mostly from Creole ethnic group and children of wealthy native countrymen. However, as the 1980s wore on, teachers and other civil servants were receiving their salaries at extremely irregular intervals, if at all, causing many to resort to further corrupt practices to make ends meet. Television broadcasts in the country ended in 1987 when Information and Broadcasting Minister Aya Mbayo sold Sierra Leone's only transmitter. 2 years later, state radio broadcasts beyond Freetown came to an end, when the radio tower fell over and the government could not pull enough funds together to raise a replacement. Between 1980 and 1987, despite triple-digit inflation, government spending on health and education declined by more than 60%. The situation seemingly bottomed out by the end of the 1980s, when official diamond exports netted the government only $22,000, while an estimated $250 million worth of the gems were exported illegally. The state of Sierra Leone's finances had so deteriorated that in 1989, Momoh lacked the hard currency reserves to pay the international printers of the country's paper currency. The president was forced to turn to one of Siaka Stevens' Afro-Lebanese associates for a loan to cover the printing bill, paying the merchant off with some of the newly printed money. Many predicted Momoh's days were numbered, as there was then a spate of unrest and strikes by students and public sector workers who increasingly could not receive their wages, and Momoh found it difficult to contain the unrests. The economy had reached such a deteriorating level that the liquidity of the banks too was adversely affected, and the national currency became scarce. Inflation continued to rise at record level, and the devaluation of the Leone continued unabated. The country was plunged into blackouts, long queues for fuel, and also for the purchase of rice. Citizens became more and more disgruntled. Momoh then decided to become tough. He initiated a number of measures to arrest the situation and to combat particularly corruption. But it was then too late. Corruption and bad governance were now well entrenched in the system, and his personal weakness to do much about it was now acknowledged. Some government ministers and other public servants were prosecuted for corruption and ordered to pay huge fines. He declared a state of economic emergency and announced measures to prevent the hoarding of the national currency, rice and fuel. He made corruption a criminal offense, but he did not put in place a mechanism to enforce the measures he took. He arrogated a lot of power to himself, but was unfortunately too weak to implement the economic emergency measures. As a result, those of his cabal seized the opportunity to carry out their own agendas, invariably illegally seizing people's assets, properties. Mild-mannered Momoh was too timid to act against this cabal. Momoh was honest to declare publicly on the airwaves that he had failed the nation. His new order and constructive nationalism remained a dream that he was unable to transform into reality. As much as he was admired for his honesty, he was vilified also that, realizing he did not have what it takes to rule the nation, he did not have the courage or the decency to resign. The situation then in the country became unbearable, and the pressure on Momoh to liberalize the political system was intense. In 1990, the United Nations Development Programme released its first Human Development Report and ranked Sierra Leone the fourth lowest in terms of its Human Development Index. A year later, Sierra Leone would occupy the absolute lowest position. The government was facing pressures to democratize as the United States, and the IMF insisted that financial assistance be tethered to evidence of democratization. Sierra Leone was in an extreme period of economic decline, social disintegration, and political corruption. As a result of the internal and external pressure on the government to liberalize the political system, on October 11, 1990, Momoh appointed a 35-member National Constitutional Review Commission, charged with examining the charter with a view to broadening the existing political process by enhancing and accommodating a wider and fairer participation of citizens therein, guaranteeing fundamental human rights and the rule of law, thereby strengthening and consolidating the democratic foundation and structure of the nation in consonance with the present national consciousness, circumstances, and realities, and to make recommendations thereon. In short, the Commission was given the mandate of dismantling the APC's single-party state. The Commission went to work immediately. Within 6 months of its establishment, it had returned a report recommending the re-establishment of a multi-party system of government. Based on this recommendation, a constitution was approved by Parliament, which was signed into law by President Momoh on September 24, 1991. On October 1st, the new constitution came into force and multi-party elections were scheduled for the end of 1992. The constitution provided for the restoration of a multi-party political system. The constitution reduces the minimum voting age from 21 to 18 years and also stipulated that the president be elected by a majority of votes cast nationwide with no less than 55% of the valid votes. In the case that no candidate wins 55% of the valid votes, The two candidates with the highest number of votes should compete in a second election, also called a runoff election. The candidate who receives the higher number of valid votes will be declared president. The president's tenure in office was limited to 2 5-year terms. In addition to appointing his or her own cabinet, the president was to have one vice president, not two, as in previous administrations. On the approval of the new constitution by Parliament, Momoh reshuffled his cabinet, dropping a number of his ministers and appointing new ministers made up largely of professionals, academics, and technocrats. He, however, retained his two vice presidents, Dr. Abdoulaye Conte and Joseph Bandabla Dauda, popularly known as J.B. Dauda. This was a watershed moment for Sierra Leone as Sierra Leoneans look forward to the practice of democracy again with all that entails. A number of the former ministers deserted from the APC. Some formed their own political parties. However, there was great suspicion that President Momoh was not serious about bringing political reforms, as most people were not sure whether the government will conduct free and fair democratic elections. The belief that the APC will turn things around in their favor was never underestimated. The new constitutional dispositions might have opened a way out of the country's political stagnation through the restoration of electoral democracy with political pluralism, but this path was ultimately cut short by other events. As it was in the midst of all these that a rebel war that was spearheaded by a rebel group called the Revolutionary United Front, the RUF, erupted in March of 1991. The RUF was headed by former Army Corporal Foday Sanko, who was dismissed from the army in 1971 and jailed for 7 years for taking part in the attempted coup that was led by the executed former army commander, Brigadier General John Amadou Bangura, against the previous APC government of Siaka Stevens. It was during his time in prison that caused his animosity towards the APC regime in general, as well as his resentment against Momoh, who succeeded the executed former army commander, Brigadier General John Amadou Bangura, as head of the army, and who Foday Sanko accused of having betrayed the executed Brigadier General John Amadou Bangura, as at the time of the abortive coup Momoh was Deputy Force Commander, and as Deputy Force Commander he refused to join the insurgents. Thus he was seen as a traitor to their cause, and it was Momoh who informed Siaka Stevens of the coup plot, which resulted in the trial and execution of Brigadier General John Amadou Bangura and 3 others. So when Momoh became president of the country, Foday Sanko, having released from prison after serving his 7-year prison term, thought it was payback time, and so he unleashed his Leviathan upon the country with the aim of overthrowing the government. The RUF claimed to be fighting to end government corruption and inequality, promising to liberate the people of Sierra Leone from poverty and injustice. However, their actions quickly revealed a very different reality. Instead of offering hope or reform, the RUF spread fear and destruction. Their tactics were some of the most brutal seen in modern warfare, and they quickly gained international notoriety for their systematic use of terror against civilians. Momoh, a former military man, had no idea or strategy to nip in the bud what started like a rebellion with mere skirmishes in a remote border town far off in the Kailahun district in the eastern province of the country. The government responded by assuring its citizens of their safety, and President Momoh responded by sending troops to fight off the insurrection. However, the army was unprepared for war. Prior to the war, the army was poorly trained and ill-equipped. The fear of a coup from the army had induced the government to keep the army relatively weak, instead investing heavily on a paramilitary body that was first known as the Internal Security Unit, the ISU, that later came to be known as the Special Security Division, the SSD, and now known as the Operations Support Division, the OSD. In fact, prior to the war, the army was relatively weak with less than 4,000 personnel, and the SSD was reported to be as large as the army. Back in late 1989, a rebellion had begun in neighboring Liberia, and in response to the conflict in Liberia, the West African regional bloc known as the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, which aimed at promoting economic and political integration, sent a peacekeeping force in 1990 to stabilize the country using Longyi Airport in Sierra Leone as backup base. The force was named ECOMOG, an acronym for Economic Community of West Africa States Monitoring Group. The majority of the ECOMOG troops were Nigerian with smaller contingents from Sierra Leone, Guinea, Gambia, and Ghana. When the civil war broke out in Sierra Leone, the Sierra Leone contingent, that was part of the Icomog peacekeeping force in Liberia, was called back by the Sierra Leonean government to repel the rebels in Sierra Leone. However, the weaponry sent to the men in the battlefronts were unfit for the rebels. The soldiers were using Second World War-era weapons and ammunition, which were regularly jammed or jammed at crucial times. Some of the weapons and communications equipment were not workable. Since the military was ill-equipped, President Momoh therefore sent his military chief, Major General Mohammed Sheku Tarawali, to Europe in order to purchase arms and ammunition. Major General Mohammed Sheku Tarawali was in Europe to purchase arms and ammunition when a group of young officers who were mostly in their 20s left the battlefield and marched down in their combat to the State House, which is the office of the president in Freetown, with anti-aircraft twin-barrel guns on April 29, 1992, and overthrew the government of President Joseph Saidu Momoh. The coup was largely popular because it promised to bring an end to the war. The coup received roaring support across the nation, and even the international world sent its best wishes. The reason the young officers gave for entering the capital was to demand the payment of their salaries, which had been in arrears for a long time. In reality, they only used this as a pretext for entering the capital. Their real motive, as it turned out, was to overthrow the government of President Momoh and assume political power. Within moments, the Momoh government capitulated. This happened so quickly because there were no institutions or mechanism in place to resist such tremor. The young soldiers formed themselves into a junta, which they named the National Provisional Ruling Council, the NPRC, with the young army captain, Captain Valentine Strasser, as its chairman and head of state of the country. Join me in my next video to know when, how, and where the NPRC coup was planned that overthrew the government of President Momoh.